Hi, welcome back to Finishing Your Quilt on Home Sewing Machine. I'm Amy Ellis, and we are going to look at some really basic free motion quilting patterns today. And I just want to give you a few tips before we get started on how you can practice and make your quilting time really count. So in front of me here, I have a few of the patterns that we're going to work on, and we're going to start with just a basic stipple. And then I have a few different loops. You can see they're all similar, but if you make them different sizes, you end up with different results. And some quilts will call for one and some will call for another. So it's up to you as the artist, as the quilter, to decide which will work best for your project. The last one here is some kind of straight lines. They're fun because they're organic. They're still done with the free motion quilting foot, and you can add them into a space that's small or large, depending on what you're working on. So I'll show you how to stitch all those out in a few minutes. One of the things I like to do to practice is actually draw. I think a lot of quilters get hung up on making the perfect circle or making the perfect loop. And it helps me to think about quilting as an extension of my handwriting. So if you look at some of these loops here, it looks like a cursive L or a cursive O. If you look at all the different letters in the alphabet, you can look at the S and have some different shapes that way. You can use an E. There's all sorts of different letters that really work well and help to translate quilting into something that you're more comfortable with. So I like to go back to paper and look at my handwriting as a jumping off point. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same, especially because we're working with moving the quilt instead of moving the pencil. But as you practice, it definitely helps build muscle memory. And doing this, just kind of go back to 3rd and 4th grade when you were learning your cursive handwriting and practice filling a page. I've also used a whiteboard so that I can erase and just start over. And I have one that's like about 14 or 15 square. That's nice because it's big enough, like a quilt top space would be, that you might quilt in one session. But you can also just erase and move on and try again. So otherwise you could go through a lot of paper as well. But there's also some apps that work really well on if you have a tablet that you can draw on with a stylus, or you can lay plexiglass over the top of your quilt top and really audition designs on the actual fabric that you're going to quilt. So we're just going to do some L's and just try and make the motion really fluid and not too jittery or jumpy. So, and this will just help you to come back and try it on fabric with a little more ease. So don't stress out. It doesn't have to be perfect. And there's a lot that you can do that's really simple and will add a lot of great texture to your quilt top. So those are just a couple of examples. And if you look more at your handwriting and see different letters that you like, who knows what you'll come up with. So there's lots of great options there. But for now, I'm going to move to the machine and we're going to talk about a stipple. And they look like puzzle pieces or maybe a cul-de-sac. Just try to think of it as something that's familiar to you so that it's not so foreign looking. I always think of it kind of as an amoeba, but I don't see many of those in everyday life. So my machine is all set up already from the settings that I recorded when I adjusted all the tension. If you're still having trouble with your tension and your stitch length, go ahead and keep practicing. It comes with time and practice, so don't get discouraged, and don't worry if it's not looking super perfect yet. Just worry about getting your tension correct and your stitch length correct before you try to get the perfect quilting lines together. So a stipple, I'll show you. I'm gonna drop my needle so that I can pull up my bobbin thread. That way I don't have a big tangle behind, and I can knot it off later if I'm in the middle of the quilt. And I put my trusty gloves on. These really help because I can grip the fabric easier without hanging on too tight. And they also are good for kind of supporting your hands. If you have, if they get fatigued easily, then that's a good tool to help with the fatigue. So take a couple of stitches to lock it down, and then just start stitching. And you'll notice you go a little bit faster, but you have to, when you're stitching your stipple or any quilting really, you want to look at where you're going, not where you're stitching at the moment. If you continue to look where your needle is right now, it's a lot more difficult to make a plan and be ready for the next curve that you need to make. And I like to kind of work across, especially on something smaller like this or in a contained space, work across and then down a little bit and then back across. So I'm trying not to be too obvious with where I'm going, but also have a plan about where I'm going. That way I'm sure to fill the entire space without leaving a big open hole anywhere. And you can always turn it. If you need to stop, wait for your needle to come down and then take your hands off. That way your needle is all the way in the fabric before you move to the next. And you may have noticed I have a little loop there. I actually am not a big stippler. I haven't really enjoyed that process because I like the fluid motion of a loop. And so, if you happen to cross over your line, it's not a big deal. Just keep going. But this is good to practice and just to get feel the fluid motion of your quilting as you're experimenting, really. And so I'm working my way around, and again, I'm looking at where I'm going, not where I've been, and not at the needle. I get dizzy if I look at the needle for too long. And the faster you go, the quicker you can move your hands. And really, this just comes with practice, and that's really what I want to encourage you guys to do today, is just take the time to practice and get comfortable with the machine in this setup, and also with moving your hands so that you're comfortable with the whole prospect of quilting your own quilts. And definitely start small if you're ready to move on to a quilt. Your sandwiches should be about 18 inches square that you're practicing on, and that's good because there is enough bulk that you are going to have to manage it a little bit. Sometimes what I like to do is break the quilt into quadrants, even if it's just in my mind, just kind of segment it out so that it's in quadrants, and that way I can kind of plan that way too. So there is a stipple, and there's a couple little spots that could be better, but overall it's a good example of what you're looking for. And I quilted the entire area. So as you're practicing your quilting, you want to make sure that you're filling an area. And if you have too much space, you can pull your ruler out and draw a square and fill that area. That way you can start in one spot and end in another and still have a finished area. Or if you wanted to do the rows like I did on my sample piece, you could piece 4.5-inch strips and have an area to quilt in the row as well. And that was easier to do just because then I could show more different options. But sometimes it's nice to have an area to fill. Next, we're going to look at these little loops here. And I think the smaller ones are easier to start with. Sometimes these bigger ones, the space can get away from you. So we're going to start small. And with these, I like to think of a capital letter L. I kind of go up and do a loop, and then go back down and do another loop. And that way the loops are alternating, and they can play off of each other a little bit more. So let's stitch that out. Let's drop the foot and pull up the bobbin thread. And you'll notice I changed my bobbin thread back to red so it matches. And it's best when you're quilting to go ahead and match your top and bobbin thread. That way, if you do have any little tension issues, they don't show up as easily. And so I'm gonna do some loops. Take a couple of stitches to make sure it's locked down tight. And then go ahead and loop around. And again, I'm looking at where I'm going and it's not where I am right now. And this is a lot of fun. I like to just add a little bit of loop to my quilting. And again, you want to look at filling the entire space that you have in front of you. So even if it's, a corner of a block that you think needs just a couple of loops, you can make them bigger or smaller to fit the space that you are working in. And a lot of people like to keep them tight together, and if you're going to do that, you're going to have to travel a little bit over the thread that you've already stitched. So, oops, looks like I need to get back up into this other corner. So, I'm going to go ahead and fill this corner first, and then I'll go back up over there. You can see some of my loops are smaller than others. It just depends on where I'm at and what I'm stitching. And again, this comes with time. You gotta practice to get your loops to look like you probably have envisioned them looking. I know sometimes it's a lot easier said than done, but if you just keep practicing, it'll come. And I always keep a scrap of fabric and batting nearby so that when I'm getting started, I have a little warm-up. That's how I like to think of it. So I can test all the settings on my machine and make sure that I'm ready to quilt, that I'm not doing, a different kind of stitch than I had envisioned. So this helps to warm up a little bit. And my hands are really light on the fabric. I'm not pulling it or keeping it too still. It helps to just I like to use my fingertips. Some of you might like to use the side of your hand, like more like your palms. So see what works better for you. It goes both ways, and it really is just a matter of comfort and what feels right to you. This little piece of fabric is kind of small, so my fingertips feel good at the moment. So I am almost to the end of this piece. And again, not all of my loops are perfect, and it just comes with practice and time. But I would sit with my dry erase board on the couch a lot of times while TV is on or my kids are doing homework, because it's something I can just doodle and do while I also interact with the family, and it doesn't take a lot of concentration to work on that muscle memory. So there we go. And there's some loops for you. So we started in this corner and went around and came back down all the way to here. In the class, there's handouts. There's some exercises, and I've drawn the different quilting designs that you can either trace or just use as inspiration. And it's kind of nice sometimes to see the path that one quilter takes to help you envision your own path when you're quilting. So that's something to use as a resource. Let's look at our next design. Let's move down here to this figure 8. It's loops going up and down this time, and these are easier to do in a row than they are in an all-over pattern. So it depends, again, on where you're quilting, but I wanted to show you just how easy they can be. So we're gonna, actually what I think I'll do is just fold and give myself a little bit of a boundary. That way it's easier to work. If you're at home, you can use your blue marker for marking that out. And so you notice here I'm not starting in the corner, I'm starting on the side instead. And we're just gonna go up in a loop to start. You wanna watch how close to the edge you're coming as well when you're quilting, because if you get too close, your stitches will not show under the binding. So I am going down and making that loop and then going back up. And you can make these as big or small as you want. If you're working on a piece that gets smaller, you could shrink them as you're stitching. Just use your stitching or your lines as a guide for how big you want your figure eights to look. Some people call this ribbon candy, or there's another name for it. That's okay. So just the loops, and you could also space them differently. So if you wanted more space in between, kind of give it a wishbone look, you could do that as well. There's lots of options with these loops. So just experiment with what you like and what works best for you. Oops, I went the wrong way on that one. We'll just call it done. So that can be a lot of fun to add the distance between the loops. You get a different look. Let's do these big loops now. They're a little bit different because we're going to start at the bottom this time. So I'm starting near where the bottom of the loop is going to be. And I really like to think of these as a cursive L. It just helps me to visualize that letter. It's funny, my youngest boy is in 3rd grade right now, and he's just starting to learn cursive. And they started with the cursive L, and he, our last name has 2 L's in it. So anytime he writes his last name down, he has cursive L's. And he was practicing his spelling the other night with cursive L's in there. So you can make these as wide of an L, a big loop, or you can make it kind of a tall, skinny loop. It's entirely up to you and what feels comfortable. And obviously these can fill a bigger space as you quilt, so that's nice. You can also do them really small and fill a smaller space. So there's a lot of variety and options available there. Let's take a look. So here you can see the skinnier versus the wider L. And I just try to maintain somewhat of a straight line across the bottom and across the top. So aiming for the same spot each time. And how I do that is as I'm quilting down, I'm looking at, where I've already quilted, and then try to keep that as close as possible. So, and the same thing when I'm stitching up. I'm looking at where I've already stitched to make sure that I hit the same spot. So let's look at these bars. They're a little bit different than what we've done so far. And they're fun because they're just kind of a good practice, and you can work on your stitch length, and also you can fill in some different areas with them. You can start at the top or the bottom, depending on where you're quilting. So I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread and just show you how we can stitch those out. They're fun. They're not too, they don't cause anxiety as much. So it could be a good place to start for you, because you don't need to keep it straight necessarily, and you could overlap a little bit if you want. One thing that is helpful if you want a nice point is to actually stop and take a couple stitches and then move across and then move down after you've taken a couple stitches in one spot. So you can see this one was more rounded, but now we'll do a cross and have a more pointed bottom there on that bar. And it really is just a matter of preference again. So see what works best for you, and if you forget one time to stop and take a couple stitches, it's not a big deal. And you can do these really close together as well and get a more texture, more organic feel to it. And if they happen to cross over, that's not a problem either. Again, I'm looking at where I'm going and not where I've been or where the needle is at the moment. So that just helps to kind of ingrain that in your brain. And if you've been quilting a lot, you want to make sure that you stop and take a break. Allow your shoulders to kind of rest and not get too tight, too bunched up. Also check under your bobbin case whenever you stop to switch a bobbin. Make sure that you don't have any lint built up underneath there. It's just a good habit to get into. I find usually if I go through one bobbin, that's not a big deal, but by the second one, I usually have a good amount of lint underneath there. So make sure that you check it often, especially if you are using a cotton thread. Those tend to have a little bit longer fibers that can get stuck underneath. But this is a lot of fun, and you could do it as big or as small as you want. So if you were working on a smaller space, it could fill that in really well. And it's a lot of fun. I like that one because it's easy. It's a good place for beginners to start, so without feeling too much anxiety over the quilting itself. The last one that we have here on the sample is these loops that are 2 different sizes, and you can think of them both as a cursive L, or you could do an L and an O. It just depends on what works best for your brain. So I'm going to start down here at the bottom on this side, drop my bobbin thread. Again, I'm just doing that so that I don't get a mess of thread underneath, because I've found that if I don't draw up the bobbin thread, it tends to get a tangle, a nest underneath there, and that's not pretty or fun to deal with. So we'll start big and then do the smaller L or smaller loop. And this is just fun to kind of break it up, give it a little different texture. And I'm looking at where I've already stitched, how high I want to go as I'm working, as it's moving, trying to make sure that I hit the same marks. So and the more that you practice these, the easier it's going to get, and the more comfortable and natural it'll feel. So make sure that you keep practicing. Let's look at this. Usually as I'm quilting, I will clean up my threads as I go too, because otherwise they tend to kind of take over. But so these are all the different ones that we've stitched here, and I like just it's kind of whimsical, the bigger L's and the smaller O's. Depending on what you're working on, it could look really cute and add a lot of texture and dimension to your quilt. So For your assignment for this lesson is to go ahead and practice. We've made extra quilt sandwiches, and I need you to, you can print the worksheets and really look over those closely and trace them with your finger, trace them with a marker or highlighter, something that'll help you just to build that muscle memory into your brain. And then just practice and see what feels comfortable to you and what you like, and then work on getting that one up to the standard that you're looking for. I know all of us quilters tend to be perfectionists, and it's, you know, it is overrated, but I know that that's what your aim is eventually going to be. So just keep practicing and you'll get there. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at a few more free motion quilting patterns that will add variety and more dimension to your quilting.